The muzzle flashes lit up the desert night like deadly fireflies as Jake Thompson pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the underground bunker. Above him, automatic gunfire shattered the silence. 8 professional killers had come to finish what they'd started when they murdered Elena's father. "Command post neutralized," Jake whispered into his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 4 down, 4 to go. Just 48 hours ago. He'd been a broken firefighter with a busted truck, seeking shelter at a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere. Now he was married to Elena Martinez, stepfather to 3 little girls, and the last line of defense protecting a $200 million secret that corrupt federal agents would kill for. The woman everyone called worthless had inherited more than just a junk gas station. Hidden beneath Pete's last stop lay evidence that could bring down the largest corruption network in DEA history, and the killers who'd murdered Pete Martinez weren't about to let his daughter live to expose them. Tonight, in the California desert, a single dad and an outcast mom would discover that sometimes the most ordinary people are called to do the most extraordinary things. If you believe in second chances, in love that heals, and in the quiet power of ordinary heroes, smash that like button and subscribe to Soul Moment Stories, because sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest miracles. The radiator hissed like an angry rattlesnake as steam billowed from under the hood of Jake Thompson's beat-up Ford pickup. The dashboard temperature gauge had been climbing into the red for the last 20 miles, but he'd been hoping, praying it would hold out until they reached Bakersfield. Now, stranded on a desolate stretch of Highway 58 in the Mojave Desert, with nothing but scrub brush and heat mirages stretching to the horizon, Jake realized his prayers had gone unanswered. "Daddy, I'm really hot." Emma's small voice drifted from the back seat, barely audible over the sound of escaping steam. Jake turned to look at his 8-year-old daughter. Her cheeks were flushed red, and her usually energetic blue eyes looked glassy and tired. The air conditioning had died with the engine, and the California desert sun was turning the truck's interior into an oven. It was 3:47 p.m., according to the dashboard clock, the worst possible time to be stranded in this wasteland. "I know. Sweetheart, we're going to get help." Jake's voice carried more confidence than he felt. His cell phone showed no signal, and they hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour. But about a quarter mile up the road, he could make out the faded outline of what looked like a gas station. The sign was too weathered to read from this distance, but it was their only option. "Can you walk that far?" he asked Emma, pointing toward the distant building. She nodded weakly, though Jake could see the effort it took. He grabbed their water bottles from the cooler, thankfully still somewhat cool, and helped Emma out of the truck. The desert heat hit them like a physical blow, the kind of dry, searing heat that sucked moisture from your lungs with every breath. They walked slowly along the cracked asphalt, Jake carrying their small overnight bag while Emma clutched his free hand. The gas station grew larger as they approached, and Jake's heart sank a little with each step. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. The windows were coated with a film of dust and grime, and one of the old-style gas pumps leaned at a precarious angle like a tired soldier. But there was a car parked beside the building, a dusty Honda Civic that looked like it actually ran. And more importantly, Jake could see light filtering through the grimy windows. Someone was inside. The hand-painted sign above the door read, "Pete's Last Stop," in faded red letters. With smaller text beneath that, Jake couldn't quite make out. He knocked on the glass door, the sound echoing hollowly in the desert stillness. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Hello, we need help." After what felt like an eternity, the door cracked open just wide enough for Jake to see a woman's face peering out. She looked to be in her early 30s, with long dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and suspicious brown eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the strangers on her doorstep. "We're closed," she said flatly, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place. "Please," Jake said, gesturing toward Emma, who was swaying slightly on her feet. "Our truck broke down. My daughter's overheating. We just need somewhere cool to sit for a few minutes and some water." The woman's eyes flicked to Emma, and Jake saw something soften in her expression just for a moment before the guarded look returned. This place doesn't have air conditioning, she said, and I don't sell anything anymore. I'm not looking to buy, Jake replied. I'm just trying to keep my daughter from getting heat stroke. Please. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the abandoned gas pumps. Finally, the woman stepped back and opened the door wider. You can come in, she said reluctantly, but just until you cool down. The interior of the gas station was like stepping back in time. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with expired snacks and motor oil that looked like it had been sitting there since the Clinton administration. An ancient cash register sat on the counter like a museum piece, and faded advertisements for long-discontinued sodas were still taped to the walls. But it was noticeably cooler inside, thanks to thick adobe walls and an old oscillating fan that wheezed and rattled as it turned. Jake had never been so grateful for such modest relief. Sit there, the woman said, pointing to a bench near the front window. I'll get water. She disappeared through a doorway behind the counter, leaving Jake and Emma alone. Emma immediately slumped against him, her small body radiating heat like a little furnace. This place is weird, Daddy, she whispered. Different doesn't always mean bad, Jake replied, though he had to admit the gas station felt more like a time capsule than a functioning business. The woman returned with 2 glasses of water and a damp towel. She handed one glass to Emma and the other to Jake, then gently pressed the cool cloth to Emma's forehead. I'm Elena, she said simply, avoiding Jake's eyes as she tended to his daughter. Jake, he replied, and this is Emma. Elena nodded but didn't respond. Jake watched as she dabbed Emma's face and neck with the cloth, her movements careful and practiced. She was clearly a mother herself. There was something in the way she automatically knew exactly what Emma needed. You live here, Jake asked. Someone has to, Elena replied curtly, before Jake could ask what that meant. 2 identical voices called out from the back room. Mama Sophia took my crayon. No, Isabella took mine. Elena's shoulders tensed visibly. Excuse me, she muttered, disappearing again through the doorway. Jake could hear her speaking in rapid Spanish, her tone firm but patient. A few minutes later, she returned with 2 girls who looked to be about Emma's age. They were clearly twins, with Elena's dark hair and eyes, dressed in mismatched clothes that were clean but well-worn. This is Mr. Jake and Emma, Elena said to the girls. They're just resting. The twins stared at the strangers with the unblinking intensity that only 8-year-olds could muster. One of them held a broken doll. The other clutched a half-colored picture of what looked like a dragon. Hi, Emma said shyly, her color already starting to return thanks to the cool air and water. Are you going to stay here? One of the twins asked. Just until our truck is fixed, Jake replied. Our truck's been broken for 6 months, the other twin announced matter-of-factly. Sophia, Elena's voice carried a warning. What it has, Sophia replied with the brutal honesty of childhood. Jake looked around the gas station with new eyes. Elena wasn't just someone who worked here, she lived here, apparently with no way to leave. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Whatever circumstances had brought her to this place, she was as stranded as he was, just in a different way. Do you know anything about engines? Elena asked, breaking into his thoughts. Some, Jake replied. I was a firefighter for 15 years. You learn to fix things when your life depends on them working. Something flickered in Elena's eyes, surprise, maybe even hope. The pump outside doesn't work. Neither does the generator in back, or the ice machine. Or, she trailed off, as if realizing she was revealing too much. I could take a look, Jake offered. If you want. Elena studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust this stranger who had wandered out of the desert. Why would you do that? Because you helped us when you didn't have to, Jake said simply. And because I don't like leaving things broken when I can fix them. That evening, as the desert began to cool from furnace hot to merely sweltering, Jake found himself elbow deep in the guts of an ancient generator behind the gas station. Elena had shown him to the machine with obvious skepticism, clearly expecting him to poke at it for a few minutes before giving up. Instead, Jake had asked for her toolbox, a surprisingly comprehensive collection that had belonged to her father. She'd explained and gotten to work. The problem turned out to be a combination of clogged fuel lines, corroded connections, and a carburetor that hadn't been cleaned since the Bush administration. The first one. "Hand me that socket wrench," Jake called out. Elena passed him the tool, her earlier suspicion gradually giving way to curiosity as she watched him work. "You really know what you're doing," she observed. "Machinery is machinery," Jake replied, his voice muffled as he reached deeper into the engine compartment. "The basics are the same, whether it's a fire truck or a generator." "What happened?" Elena asked suddenly. "Why aren't you fighting fires anymore?" Jake's hands stilled for a moment. It was a question he'd been dreading, but had known would come eventually. "Lost a friend in a warehouse fire last year. After that, I couldn't I couldn't trust myself to make the right calls anymore. When other people's lives depend on your judgment and you start second-guessing yourself," he trailed off, then resumed working on the generator. "It was time to walk away." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Yeah, me too." Jake tightened a connection and wiped grease from his hands. "What about you? How did you end up here?" Elena's expression closed off slightly. "My father died last year, left me this place. And your brothers and sisters?" A bitter laugh escaped Elena's lips. "They got the smart genes, went to college, moved to the city, married well. I got the gas station nobody wanted." She paused, then added quietly, "They laughed when they found out what Dad left me." Actually laughed. Jake emerged from behind the generator and looked at her directly. "Their loss? Is it?" Elena's voice was sharp with self-doubt. "Look around. Jake, this place is falling apart. I can barely keep food on the table for my girls." Maybe they were right to laugh. "The girls seem happy," Jake observed. "Kids are resilient. They don't know they're supposed to be ashamed of living in an abandoned gas station." Jake started to respond, but the generator suddenly coughed to life with a rumbling roar. Elena's eyes widened as lights flickered on in the back room of the station. "You fixed it," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "I told you machinery is machinery." Jake grinned, pleased with himself despite everything. "Though you'll want to run it on a timer. It's old enough that constant use might burn it out." As if summoned by the sound of the generator, the three girls came running outside. Emma had clearly bonded with Sophia and Isabella during the afternoon. Jake could see them whispering and giggling together, like they'd been friends for years rather than hours. "The lights work," Isabella announced. "Can we have ice cream now?" Sophia asked hopefully. Elena shook her head. "The freezer needs time to get cold." "Mija." "Tomorrow," Sophia pressed. "We'll see," Elena replied. The universal parent response that meant, "Probably not, but I don't want to crush your dreams right now." Jake watched this exchange with a strange feeling in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd been part of a family moment that didn't involve lawyers or custody hearings or his ex-wife explaining why she couldn't take Emma for the weekend after all. "Where are you two headed?" Elena asked as they walked back toward the station. "Bakersfield, originally," Jake replied. "I've got a job interview at a construction company there. Nothing fancy, but it's steady work." "And if you don't get it," Jake shrugged, "keep looking. I guess there's not much choice." Elena stopped walking. "What if there was another choice?" Jake turned to look at her, struck by something in her tone. "What do you mean, I mean? What if instead of going to Bakersfield to ask someone else for a job, you stayed here and we figured out how to make this place work again?" The question hung in the desert air between them. Jake could hear the generator humming steadily in the background, a sound of possibility in a place that had seemed hopeless just hours before. "Elena," he said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I don't know anything about running a gas station. And even if I did, this place would need a lot of work to be profitable again." "I'm not talking about profit," Elena replied. "I'm talking about survival, about giving our girls a place to call home instead of just somewhere to exist." Jake looked back at Emma, who was teaching Sophia and Isabella some complicated hand-clapping game. His daughter hadn't smiled this much in months, since the divorce, since the move, since everything fell apart. Emma had been a quiet, serious child carrying burdens no 8-year-old should have to bear. But here, in this broken-down place in the middle of nowhere, she looked like a kid again. "It's crazy," he said finally. "Most of the best ideas are." Elena replied. That night, Jake lay on a thin mattress in what used to be Pete's office, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the desert wind rattle the windows. Emma was fast asleep beside him, exhausted from the day's adventure. Through the thin walls, he could hear Elena moving around quietly, probably checking on her own girls. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been whether he could afford gas to get to Bakersfield. Now he was contemplating completely upending his life to help a woman he just met save a gas station that probably couldn't be saved. It was insane. It was also the first time in over a year that he'd felt genuinely useful. The next morning, Jake woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been breakfast cooking on a camp stove. Elena was already up, moving around the main area of the station with quiet efficiency, the early morning light streaming through the newly cleaned windows. When had she done that revealed details he'd missed the day before? This place hadn't always been a wreck. He could see signs of care in the way the shelves were organized, the way certain areas had been kept cleaner than others. Elena had been fighting a losing battle against time and entropy, but she'd been fighting nonetheless. "Morning," she said without turning around as he emerged from the office. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thanks." Jake accepted the mug she offered, noting that it was chipped but clean, like everything else here. "You're up early." "I don't sleep much," Elena replied with a shrug. "Too much to worry about." "Like what?" Elena gestured vaguely around the station. "Everything. The roof leaks when it rains. The plumbing is held together with prayer and duct tape. The electrical system is older than I am. And that's just the building." "What about the business side?" "What business?" Elena's laugh was hollow. "We haven't sold gas in over a decade. I make a little money selling snacks to truckers who get lost and end up here, but it's barely enough to buy groceries." Jake sipped his coffee and studied the gas pumps visible through the front window. "What would it take to get them working again?" "More money than I have," Elena replied flatly. "The underground tanks would need to be replaced. Environmental regulations. New pumps, new safety systems, permits, inspections." She trailed off. "Even if I could afford all that, who's going to stop for gas in the middle of nowhere when they can get it cheaper in town?" "People traveling between LA and Vegas," Jake said thoughtfully. "Truckers who need a place to rest, families on road trips who want to avoid the chain stations." Elena looked at him skeptically. "You think there's really a market for that?" "I think there's always a market for genuine hospitality," Jake replied. "The question is whether we can provide it." The word "we" hung in the air between them. Elena stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was serious or just making conversation. "Jake," she said slowly, "I need to tell you something." Before she could continue, a car engine sounded outside. They both turned to see a sleek black sedan pulling up to the station, the kind of car that looked expensive, even covered in desert dust. Two people got out, a man in his 40s wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jake made in a month, and a woman about Elena's age dressed like she was heading to a business meeting in Beverly Hills. Elena's face went pale. "Oh, no," she whispered. "Who are they?" Jake asked. "My brother and sister," Elena replied, her voice tight with dread. "This can't be good." The man knocked on the door with the kind of authoritative rap that suggested he was used to being answered immediately. Elena took a deep breath and went to open it. "Tony, Maria," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "What brings you out here?" Tony Martinez was clearly Elena's older brother. They shared the same dark eyes and stubborn jawline, though his were framed by expensive glasses and a haircut that screamed, "Successful businessman." Maria looked like a polished version of Elena, with professionally styled hair and makeup that hadn't moved despite the desert heat. "Elena," Tony said, stepping inside without being invited. "We need to talk." "About what?" Elena crossed her arms defensively. Maria's gaze swept dismissively around the gas station's interior before landing on Jake. "Who's this?" "A friend," Elena replied. "Jake, these are my siblings, Tony and Maria." Jake stepped forward and extended his hand. "Jake Thompson." Tony shook it briefly, his grip firm but distracted. Maria simply nodded, clearly uninterested in pleasantries. Elena, Maria said, we've been thinking about your situation here, and we've come up with a solution. My situation is fine, Elena replied quickly. Is it? Tony pulled out his phone and showed Elena what looked like a real estate listing. Because I found this online yesterday, the Riverside Development Group is looking to buy large parcels of land along this highway for a truck stop complex. They're offering top dollar. Elena's face went even paler. I'm not selling. Don't be ridiculous, Maria said sharply. Look at this place. Elena, it's falling apart. You're living like a squatter in Dad's old building, barely scraping by, raising your girls in the middle of nowhere with no future, no opportunities. We're fine, Elena interrupted, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in her voice. You're not fine, Tony said, his tone slightly gentler than his sister's, but no less determined. And you know it. This development deal could set you up for life. You could buy a real house in a real neighborhood, send the girls to good schools. These are good school, Elena protested weakly. Elena, Maria's voice took on the patronizing tone of an older sister who'd always been considered the smart one. Be realistic. What's your 5-year plan here? 10-year plan. You can't just hide out in the desert forever. Jake watched Elena's face as her siblings spoke, seeing her confidence crumble a little more with each word. Everything they were saying probably echoed doubts she'd been carrying for months. How much are they offering? Elena asked quietly. Tony's smile was triumphant. 2.7 million for this worthless piece of desert. Jake's coffee mug nearly slipped from his hand. $2.7 million for this place. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. That's, Elena started, then stopped. That's a lot of money. It's enough to completely change your life, Maria pressed. And the girls' lives. Elena, think about what you could do with that money. I am thinking about it, Elena snapped, some of her fire returning. I'm thinking about how Dad worked his whole life to build this place, and how you two couldn't wait to get away from it. Now suddenly it's worth millions, and you're very concerned about my future. Tony and Maria exchanged a glance that Jake didn't miss. Of course we're concerned, Tony said. You're our sister. Where was that concern last year when Dad died and I was handling everything alone? Where was it 6 months ago when the twins were sick and I couldn't afford to take them to the doctor? We offered to help, Maria said defensively. You offered to help me sell the place and move to the city. Elena corrected. That's different. Another car pulled up outside this one, a white pickup truck with Riverside Development painted on the side. A man in khakis and a polo shirt got out and approached the station. That'll be Mr. Henderson, Tony said, checking his watch. Right on time. Elena stared at her brother in disbelief. You brought a buyer without even asking me. We thought it would be good for you to hear the offer directly, Maria said. No pressure, just information. Jake had heard enough. He set down his coffee mug and stepped closer to Elena. You don't have to do this now, he said quietly. You don't have to do this at all. Tony looked at Jake as if noticing him for the first time. I'm sorry, but this is a family matter. Elena's family includes her daughters, Jake replied evenly. And they're not here to speak for themselves. The girls will be better off in a stable environment, Maria said. Surely you can see that. Jake felt his temper rise, but Elena spoke before he could respond. Get out, she said, her voice low but steady. Elena. Tony started. Get out, she repeated, louder this time. All of you, and take your buyer with you. You're making a mistake, Maria warned. This kind of opportunity doesn't come along twice. Maybe not, Elena agreed. But it's my mistake to make. After her siblings and the developer left Henderson looking particularly frustrated at having driven all this way for nothing, Elena sank onto the bench where Emma had sat the day before. She looked exhausted, as if the confrontation had drained all her energy. You okay? Jake asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. $2.7 million, she said finally. Do you know what I could do with that kind of money? Yeah, Jake replied. But do you know what you'd lose? Elena looked up at him. What do you mean? This place is the last connection your daughters have to their grandfather. It's their history, their roots. Money can buy them a lot of things, but it can't buy them that. History doesn't pay for college, Elena said bitterly. No, but it gives them something to build on, something that's theirs, not bought with someone else's money. Elena stood and walked to the window, staring out at the desert landscape. You think I'm crazy for not taking the money? I think you're brave for not taking the easy way out. Even if the easy way might be better for my girls, Jake joined her at the window. Elena, I've seen what happens when parents make decisions based on what they think is better for their kids without considering what those kids actually need. Sometimes the thing that looks like sacrifice is actually love. And sometimes it's just stubbornness disguised as principle. Maybe, Jake agreed. But I don't think that's what this is. Elena was quiet for several minutes, watching the heat waves shimmer off the asphalt outside. Finally, she turned to face him. Jake, she said, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. Marry me. Jake blinked, certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry, what, marry me, Elena repeated, her tone matter-of-fact despite the enormity of what she was suggesting. Not for love or romance or any of that. For legal protection. Legal protection from what? My siblings, Elena explained. Right now, since Dad didn't leave a will, they could potentially contest my ownership of this place. But if I'm married, especially to someone who's been helping maintain the property, it strengthens my legal position. It makes it much harder for them to claim I'm an unfit guardian or that the property should be sold for the children's benefit. Jake stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. Elena, marriage is a pretty extreme solution to a legal problem. I'm facing a pretty extreme problem, she replied, and I trust you. You could have taken advantage of the situation yesterday's stranded woman alone with her children, but you didn't. You helped without expecting anything in return. You stood up to my family just now when you didn't have to. That doesn't mean we should get married. Why not? Elena's voice carried a note of desperation. You said yourself that you don't have anywhere else to go. Emma seems happy here. The girls already adore her. We could make this work. Jake ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by the speed at which his life was changing. Elena, this is crazy. Most of the best ideas are, she replied, echoing what she'd said the night before. Jake, I'm not asking you to fall in love with me. I'm asking you to help me save the only home my daughters have ever known. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. Jake thought about the job interview in Bakersfield that he'd probably already missed. He thought about the apartment he'd been planning to rent, small and clean and utterly forgettable. He thought about Emma spending another year in a new school, making new friends only to leave them behind when the next opportunity came along. Then he looked at Elena, this woman who was willing to enter a marriage of convenience to protect her family's legacy. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth staying for. If we do this, he said slowly, it's not just about legal protection. It's about building something together, making this place work not just as a business, but as a home. Elena's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope. Does that mean yes? Jake took a deep breath. That means yes. They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace in Barstow, with Emma, Sophia, and Isabella as their witnesses. Elena wore a simple blue dress she'd bought at a thrift store in town, and Jake wore his one good shirt, the same one he'd planned to wear to the job interview in Bakersfield. The ceremony was brief and practical, just like the marriage it was creating. When the judge asked if they promised to honor and cherish each other, they both answered I do with the solemnity of people signing a business contract rather than declaring eternal love. But when Jake slipped the simple gold band onto Elena's finger, a ring they'd bought at a pawn shop for $37, something passed between them that felt like more than just legal convenience. It felt like partnership. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them needed. After the ceremony, they drove back to Pete's last stop as a family officially, legally, and in ways that surprised them both. Genuinely, the girls chattered excitedly in the back seat about their new living arrangements, already making plans for how to rearrange their shared bedroom and what games they'd teach each other. That evening, as the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake and Elena sat on the front steps of the gas station, watching their daughters play in the dirt lot that served as a front yard. The generator hummed quietly in the background, and for the first time in months, Elena allowed herself to feel something approaching contentment. "No regrets?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Ask me again in a year," he said finally. "But right now, no, no regrets." Elena nodded, satisfied with that answer. Jake, "Yeah, thank you for staying." Jake looked at her, this woman who had become his wife in the most unconventional way possible, and smiled. "Thank you for letting me," as the stars began to appear in the clear desert sky. Jake found himself thinking that maybe sometimes the best destinations were the ones you never planned to reach. Maybe sometimes getting lost was just another way of being found. The first month of marriage was an exercise in careful choreography. Jake and Elena moved around each other in the cramped quarters of the gas station like dancers learning new steps, polite, cautious, hyper-aware of boundaries that hadn't been negotiated yet. They shared meals and parenting duties, work and worry, but they slept in separate rooms and spoke to each other with the careful courtesy of strangers who happened to share the same last name. Jake had converted the old storage room into a makeshift bedroom for himself, while Elena kept the small apartment space above the station that she'd shared with the twins since Pete's death. Emma moved in with Sophia and Isabella, and within days the three girls had created their own chaotic sisterhood, complete with inside jokes, elaborate games, and the kind of fierce loyalty that only children could forge so quickly. The legal benefits of their marriage became apparent almost immediately. When Tony called to pressure Elena about the development deal, she was able to tell him firmly that any major decisions about the property would need to be discussed with her husband. When Maria showed up unannounced one afternoon with more real estate brochures, Jake answered the door and politely but firmly informed her that they weren't interested in selling. "This is ridiculous, Elena," Maria had said, looking past Jake as if he weren't there. "You can't make life-altering decisions based on some fantasy about running a gas station." "I'm not making decisions based on fantasy," Elena had replied calmly. "I'm making them based on what's best for my family. Your real family or this arrangement you've created." Jake had stepped forward then, his voice deadly quiet. "I'd be very careful about questioning the legitimacy of this family. Maria, especially since Elena's arrangement seems to be working a lot better than whatever you and Tony have been offering." After Maria left muttering about lawyers and competency hearings, Elena had found Jake in the back room, methodically cleaning engine parts with more force than was strictly necessary. "Thank you," she'd said simply. "For what? For having my back. For not letting her make me feel like an idiot for wanting to stay here." Jake had looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning. "Elena, you're a lot of things, but an idiot isn't one of them." It was the first time either of them had offered genuine praise to the other, and Elena had felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not love, not yet, but something like the possibility of it. As Jake settled into life at Pete's last stop, he began to understand why Elena had fought so hard to keep it. The place had bones, good bones that had been buried under years of deferred maintenance and financial struggle. The original construction was solid, built to withstand desert storms and blazing summers. The location, while remote, was actually strategic, positioned at a crossroads where several back highways converged, a natural stopping point for travelers avoiding the busier interstates. More importantly, he began to see traces of the man Pete Martinez had been. In the careful way the original electrical system had been laid out, with redundancies and safety features that went beyond code requirements. In the hand-built shelving that was sturdy enough to last decades. In the garden space behind the building where Pete had clearly spent countless hours nurturing vegetables and soil that shouldn't have supported anything more ambitious than cactus. He was good with his hands. Elena told Jake one evening as they worked together to repair a section of roof that had been leaking since the last big storm. Could fix anything. I used to think it was just stubbornness, refusing to pay someone else to do what he could do himself. But now I think it was pride. Good pride. You know, the kind that comes from building something that lasts. Jake understood that kind of pride. It was the same thing that had driven him to spend hours maintaining fire department equipment, making sure every hose and pump and ladder was ready when lives depended on it. It was craftsmanship elevated to a kind of devotion. Did he ever talk about expanding the business? Jake asked, hammering a shingle into place. Maybe adding a diner or a motel. He talked about a lot of things, Elena replied carefully, but most of them seemed like pipe dreams. You know how men get sometimes always planning some big project that never quite happens? Something in her tone made Jake look up from his work. There was an odd quality to her voice, as if she were choosing her words very carefully. What kind of projects? Elena was quiet for a moment, focused intently on the tar she was spreading around a vent pipe. Just improvements. Better equipment. Maybe some kind of workshop space. He was always sketching ideas in this old notebook he carried around. Do you still have it? The notebook somewhere, Elena said vaguely. Probably in one of the boxes I haven't gotten around to going through yet. It was the first time Jake had caught Elena being evasive about something, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. They were supposed to be partners now, weren't they? Wasn't the whole point of this arrangement that they trusted each other, but he let it slide, figuring that everyone was entitled to their secrets, especially in a marriage that was more business arrangement than love story. Still, the conversation stayed with him, nagging at the back of his mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. 2 weeks later, while Jake was replacing the pump motor for the station's well water, he found the first piece of that puzzle. He'd been lying on his back under the pump housing, trying to reach a corroded fitting that Pete had apparently jury-rigged years earlier. When his elbow knocked against something that felt wrong, instead of the smooth concrete foundation he'd been expecting, his arm hit what felt like a metal plate. Jake scooted out from under the pump and grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the space he'd been working in. He could clearly see a rectangular metal cover, about 2 feet by 3 feet, set flush with the concrete floor. It looked like an access panel of some kind, but there were no visible hinges or latches. "Elena," he called out, "can you come here for a minute?" She appeared in the doorway of the pump house, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's wrong?" "Probably nothing," Jake said. "But there's something weird under here. Take a look." Elena crouched down beside him, and Jake pointed his flashlight at the metal panel. He watched her face carefully, looking for surprise or confusion. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like recognition, quickly followed by what might have been fear. "I've never noticed that before," she said, but her voice carried the same careful tone she'd used when talking about Pete's notebook. "It looks like an access panel," Jake said. "Maybe for electrical or plumbing, but I can't figure out how to open it." "Maybe it's not supposed to open," Elena suggested. "Maybe it's just decorative or something." Jake looked at her incredulously. "Elena, nobody puts decorative metal panels in a pump house floor." "Well, I don't know what it is," she snapped, her defensiveness confirming Jake's growing suspicion that she knew more than she was saying. "Maybe Dad just covered up some old pipe or something. Does it matter?" "It matters if there's a water leak or electrical problem that I need to access," Jake replied evenly. "And it matters because I thought we were supposed to be honest with each other." Elena's face flushed. "We are being honest." "Are we? Because you're acting like you've seen this before?" For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dim light of the pump house, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Elena sighed and sat back on her heels. "There are things about this place," she said slowly, "about my father, that I don't fully understand myself. Things that might be better left alone." "What kind of things?" "The kind that could cause problems for people who ask too many questions." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the concrete floor. "Elena, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that my father was a very private man, who didn't like explaining himself to anyone, including his family. Elena stood up, brushing dust off her jeans. He told me once that this place had secrets that weren't mine to share. Maybe this is one of them. And you're okay with that, living on top of secrets you don't understand? I'm okay with respecting my father's wishes, Elena replied firmly. Even if those wishes don't make sense to me. Jake wanted to argue, wanted to push for more answers. But something in Elena's expression stopped him. There was fear there, real fear, mixed with a kind of resignation that suggested this conversation had been inevitable from the moment they'd met. Elena, he said gently, whatever this is, we can handle it together. That's what partners do. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, Jake, and some secrets end up burying the people who keep them. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bed in the converted storage room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about metal panels and careful evasions, and the look in Elena's eyes when she'd said that some secrets were meant to stay buried. He thought about Pete Martinez, the man who'd built this place with such obvious care and skill. What kind of secrets would a small-town mechanic need to keep? What could be so dangerous that even his own daughter was afraid to know the truth? Jake had spent 15 years in emergency services. He'd seen enough of human nature's dark side to know that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things, both good and bad. He'd also seen enough cover-ups and conspiracies to know that the most dangerous secrets were usually hidden in the most mundane places. Around 2 a.m. He gave up on sleep and walked quietly through the gas station to the kitchen area. Elena was there, sitting at the small table with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the desert darkness. Couldn't sleep either, she asked without turning around. Too much to think about, Jake replied, settling into the chair across from her. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the desert wind and the distant hum of the generator. Finally, Elena spoke. When I was a little girl, she said, maybe 8 or 9, I found a box hidden in Dad's workshop. It was full of photographs, people I didn't recognize, places I'd never seen. When I asked him about it, he got angry, not just annoyed, but really angry. He told me that some things were none of my business and that curiosity could get people hurt. What happened to the box? I never saw it again. A few days later, I went back to look for it, and it was gone. Dad never mentioned it, and I was too scared to ask. Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Elena, whatever your father was involved in, it doesn't have to define you, or us. Doesn't it? Elena's voice was small, uncertain. What if he was involved in something illegal? What if that's where the money came from to build this place? What if everything I've been fighting to preserve is built on something terrible? Then we deal with it, Jake said firmly, together. But we can't make that decision without knowing what we're dealing with. Elena was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The access panel, she said. It's not the only one. Jake's pulse quickened. What do you mean there are others? In the workshop? In the basement storage area? Places Dad told me never to go when I was a kid. Elena met his eyes. I think my father was hiding more than just old photographs. The next morning, Elena led Jake to a storage area in the basement that he hadn't even known existed, hidden behind a false wall that looked like it held cleaning supplies. A narrow staircase descended into what had once been a natural cave system, now reinforced with concrete and steel. Jesus, Jake breathed as his flashlight beam revealed the extent of the space. The basement was larger than the gas station above it, divided into several chambers, connected by narrow corridors. How long has this been here? I don't know, Elena admitted. Dad always said the basement was just for storage, and that it wasn't safe for children. I believed him until about a year ago. What happened a year ago? I was looking for Christmas decorations, and I accidentally knocked over some boxes when I went to clean up the mess. I noticed that the wall didn't sound solid when I bumped into it. It took me weeks to work up the courage to investigate. They moved deeper into the basement, their footsteps echoing in the concrete chambers. Jake's flashlight revealed evidence of long-term use electrical outlets, ventilation systems, and most intriguingly, Several more metal access panels set into the floor and walls. Elena, Jake said slowly, this isn't just a basement. This is a bunker. I know. Built by your father. I think so, or at least modified by him. Elena pointed to one of the walls where fresh concrete had been used to seal what looked like it might once have been a tunnel entrance. Some of this work looks newer than the rest. Jake knelt beside one of the floor panels and examined it more closely. Unlike the one in the pump house, this panel had visible bolt heads around the perimeter. This one looks like it's meant to be opened. Jake! Elena's voice carried a warning. Maybe we should… Elena, we're married. We live here. Our children live here. We have a right to know what's under our own house. Elena was quiet for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. You're right. But if we're going to do this, we do it carefully, and if we find something that's dangerous or illegal, we figure out how to handle it responsibly. Agreed. It took them nearly an hour to remove all the bolts holding the panel in place. When Jake finally lifted it away, they found themselves looking down into another chamber. This one smaller but clearly purpose-built. A metal ladder was bolted to one wall, descending into darkness. I'll go first, Jake said, testing the ladder's stability. We go together, Elena replied firmly. Whatever's down there, we face it as a team. The chamber below was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, each one carefully organized and labeled. But it wasn't the organization that took his breath away. It was what was being organized. Weapons, communication equipment, surveillance gear, boxes of ammunition and explosives, maps marked with routes and coordinates, and in the center of it all, a desk with multiple monitors and radio equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything a small-town mechanic should have needed. Elena, Jake whispered, what the hell was your father involved in? Elena moved to the desk and picked up a thick folder labeled with her name. Inside were documents she'd never seen before: birth certificates, social security cards, and passports, all with her photograph, but different names and backgrounds. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. Why would Dad have fake identification for me? Jake was examining the weapons rack, his firefighter training helping him identify military-grade equipment mixed in with more standard civilian firearms. Elena, this isn't just someone's hobby collection. This is a professional operation. But what kind of operation? Dad was a mechanic. He fixed cars and sold gas and minded his own business. Maybe that was his cover story. Elena sank into the chair at the desk, overwhelmed by the implications of what they'd discovered. You think my father was some kind of criminal? I think your father was some kind of agent, Jake replied, pointing to a collection of official-looking documents he'd found in one of the desk drawers. Look at these. The papers were heavily redacted, but enough was visible to make their purpose clear: government contracts, security clearances, and what appeared to be payment vouchers from agencies identified only by acronyms Jake didn't recognize. Elena, he said carefully, I think your father worked for the government, some part of it that doesn't officially exist. That's impossible. Is it? Think about it, the location of this place. The perfect cover of a small business that nobody pays attention to. The fact that he built all this infrastructure without anyone in town knowing about it. The way he taught you to be self-sufficient and suspicious of outsiders.